All right, let's dive right into this. Because if you've been paying even a little bit of attention to the international markets lately, you've definitely seen the staggering headlines. The Trump administration just announced this sweeping, massive new tariff policy aimed directly at one of its closest neighbors and top trading partners, Canada. But as we know, in the world of global economics, the headlines rarely tell the whole story, right? So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're distilling the latest trade data and reports to look right past that surface level shock. We're going to unpack what we're calling the iceberg model of this trade dispute. We're going to build a narrative out of the data so we can actually understand the real mechanics, the intense legal maneuvering, and the actual boots on the ground financial realities that are hiding just beneath the water. So we have to start with the number that literally sent shockwaves through the financial sector, 50%. The administration announced a massive 50% tariff on Canadian imports. Now, to really grasp the sheer gravity of that number, you have to keep in mind that this 50% penalty, it goes directly on top of any other tariffs those specific goods are already facing. It is an incredibly aggressive figure, and it is absolutely designed to grab immediate attention. And it's not just the percentage, it's the sheer volume and the timeline we're looking at here. We are talking about roughly $20 billion worth of goods imported from Canada falling under this new tariff umbrella. And the clock is ticking, loudly. These tariffs are set to take effect just a month after they were announced, circling August 19th on the calendar as this massive looming deadline. I mean, it reads like a tense financial thriller. A huge sum of money, a steep penalty, and a rapidly approaching countdown.
Which brings us to the central question that really frames our entire narrative today. Are we actually standing on the precipice of a catastrophic trade war with a key ally? Or is this simply high-stakes, corporate-styled negotiation tactics playing out on a geopolitical stage? To figure that out, we have to transition past the initial shock of that $20 billion figure and dig into the actual strategic layers driving the policy.
Part 1. The USMCA leverage play.
To really grasp this timeline and what's happening, it actually helps to look at the US and Canada neutrally, kind of like two massive corporate entities locked in a bitter contract dispute, because the core motive here isn't random at all. It's deeply tied to one specific agreement. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, was President Trump's signature trade achievement during his first term. It was the golden contract. But fast forward just 6 years to this past summer, when that exact agreement was up for renewal, and the president decided he just did not want to extend it. That single decision abruptly halted all the momentum and left the entire USMCA hanging in a state of limbo.
So, the crucial point is how the U.S. has handled that limbo with its two different partners. If you look at Mexico, the U.S. has been actively negotiating. We've literally seen U.S. officials physically down in Mexico City at the negotiating table. But Canada? Canada is fundamentally not at the table in the same way. They are completely isolated in this specific dynamic, and that isolation is exactly why Canada is now facing the intense pressure of these looming tariffs.
The administration's strategy behind these tariffs really boils down to three distinct goals. First, and definitely most directly, they want to force Canada to concede to U.S. demands regarding the USMCA renegotiation. Second, they're looking to gain broader, general leverage over Canada, essentially reminding them, hey, you rely heavily on the U.S. economy to survive. And third, this is a massive megaphone to the rest of the world. It sends a very sharp warning message to any other U.S. trading partners. If you do something the administration doesn't like, or if you try to retaliate, you could be staring down a 50% tariff of your own.
Part 2. The legal mechanics and shifting authorities.
Because look, having a goal is one thing, right? Actually having the legal power to execute it is another story entirely. Since previous tariff tools were deemed unlawful by the Supreme Court earlier this year, the administration is actively shifting its authorities and looking for creative ways to piece back together a tariff agenda. Enter Section 338. Think of this as the forgotten fine print in a massive financial contract. Section 338 is a specific, older trade authority that the administration has essentially dusted off and is now utilizing specifically to target these Canadian imports. It's the precise legal mechanism driving this whole August 19th policy. But Section 338 is just a targeted surgical tool. The much broader weapon in the administration's arsenal is Section 301. This is the primary authority they're looking to use to reimpose the bulk of their tariff agenda. For example, we saw a forced labor Section 301 action that attempted to impose a baseline 10 to 12.5% tariff on nearly 99.5% of everything the U.S. buys from abroad. Now, there are heavy arguments against that kind of sweeping maneuver, and it's already facing intense court challenges, but it remains a truly critical piece of the administration's legal machinery.
Let's move on and see how this actually builds out globally. Because beyond the forced labor argument, there's another major Section 301 investigation currently ongoing in the reports. This one is digging into the idea of excess capacity, which is basically the claim that certain trading partners are producing way too much stuff, which inherently hurts U.S. manufacturers. And just look at the target list for this investigation. Canada is right there, alongside the European Union, Mexico, Japan, and 12 other economies. That's 16 major global economies in total, meaning Canada's current tariff situation, it's really just one localized battle in a much larger global trade war strategy.
Part 3. Unpacking the trade battlegrounds.
Okay, so we know the motive and we know the legal mechanics. Let's zoom back in on Canada and look at the actual ground game. And this brilliantly illustrates what's going on, because the administration has targeted specific industries where they claim the U.S. is just not being treated fairly. When we look at the ground game, we see this intense tit-for-tat retaliation happening across three main friction points: dairy, cars, and alcohol. Let's briefly walk through the mini-narrative of each one of these to see exactly how we got here.
First up, dairy. Man, this has historically been one of the absolute stickiest trade issues between the US and Canada. The Canadian dairy market is highly, highly protected. Now, they tried to fix this back in the original USMCA by setting up a quota system. Basically, the US can export a certain amount of dairy into Canada tariff-free. But the literal second that quota is filled, the tariffs don't just go up slightly. They skyrocket to a staggering 200% in some cases. It's an incredibly steep cliff that the U.S. administration wants completely leveled out.
Next, we look at the automotive industry, which has its own dramatic chain reaction going on. Since President Trump took office a second time, some U.S. car companies have moved their manufacturing out of Canada and brought it back into the United States. Naturally, Canada wasn't thrilled about losing those jobs and facilities, so they retaliated by dramatically reducing the share of U.S. car imports that could come in tariff-free. But they didn't stop there. As a direct leverage play against the U.S. tariffs introduced in 2025, Canada actually went over to China and offered to import Chinese electric vehicles. They were essentially telling the U.S., hey, if you don't give us a decent deal in the USMCA, we have other options on the global stage.
And then we have the alcohol sector, which honestly contains this fascinating, ironic twist. As an early retaliation against U.S. tariffs, many Canadian provinces initiated what was basically a ban on purchasing U.S. distilled spirits, which caused U.S. exports to Canada to completely crater by 73%. So U.S. government stepped in to protect their distillers by proposing this new 50% tariff on Canadian spirits. But listen to this quote from the U.S. distillers themselves. "We appreciate and recognize what the Trump administration is trying to do, but we don't want a 50% tariff applied on Canadian distilled spirits. The very domestic industry the tariffs are supposed to be protecting is actually begging for them not to be implemented. They likely fear even further retaliation that would just permanently damage their cross-border supply chains."
Part 4, the 5% reality.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the massive reality check it provides. We've seen the aggressive posturing, the $20 billion headline, the fierce battlegrounds. But to truly understand this narrative, we have to look below the water level of our iceberg at the actual practical financial impact. And what's fascinating here is how the data completely undercuts the initial panic. A 50% tariff on a top trading partner sounds historically aggressive, for sure. But when you look at the actual numbers, it is incredibly limited in scope. Out of everything the United States buys from Canada, this terrifying $20 billion tariff action only actually impacts 5% of goods. A massive 95% of cross-border trade remains completely, 100% unaffected by the specific August 19th action. And actually, scratch that. The reality is even less damaging than that 5% makes it seem. Why? Because of modern global supply chains. The goods that make up that 5% are largely items that U.S. importers can easily just pivot and buy from somewhere else. If the tariff makes Canadian goods too expensive, American buyers will simply shift their purchase orders to other countries, completely bypassing the 50% penalty altogether. So if you're a consumer worried about immediate price hikes at the store, in practice, this acts much, much more like a surgical, highly visible warning shot than a truly devastating economic bomb. So we return right back to where we started, but with a much, much clearer view of the iceberg. What looks like a $20 billion catastrophic trade war on the surface reveals itself to be a highly calculated, tightly scoped strategic bluff designed to force Canada's hand at the USMCA negotiating table. It leaves us with a pretty provocative thought as we watch this August 19th deadline approach. As global markets continue to shift and evolve, will future international trade deals rely on the spirit of genuine partnership, or have we fully entered an era where agreements are driven almost exclusively by weaponized leverage? It's a truly fascinating dynamic, and it's one we are going to be watching very, very closely. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the headlines.